A rich senator's son thought nobody could stop him. His daddy's money made him feel like royalty. He picked on a kind gas station worker just because he could, and he didn't care about any rules. But he made one big mistake. He didn't see the old beat-up truck parked nearby, or the trained Navy SEAL sitting inside with his smart German Shepherd dog. These two were about to teach some powerful bullies a lesson they'd never forget. Tell us which state or country you're watching from. If you like this story, please click subscribe to see more just like it. The late afternoon sun was hanging low in the western sky, making long golden shadows stretch across the quiet town of Silver Creek. The warmth felt baked into the ground, like a comfortable dry heat you get in early fall in this part of America. The sky was a big canvas of deep blue, with wispy white clouds that looked like an artist's brushstrokes. Silver Creek looked frozen in time, like something from old America, where Main Street was the heart of everything and flags waved gently from almost every front porch. Red brick buildings with faded white paint lined the streets. The air smelled faintly sweet from pine trees in the nearby forests, mixed with dust from the open road. An old 1978 Ford truck, once painted bright blue, but now covered in road dust and patches of gray primer, rumbled slowly down the main street. The engine hummed with a deep, steady rhythm that showed years of careful care, even though it was old. Behind the steering wheel sat Mark Thompson, a man whose tough appearance told its own story. He was around 35 years old with short brown hair and a face marked with lines from someone who'd spent years squinting against the sun in faraway sandy places. His light brown eyes scanned everything around him with sharp attention, a habit he couldn't turn off. Sitting beside him, with his head resting on the open window frame, was Max, a beautiful German shepherd with thick black and tan fur. Max's ears twitched at the new sounds of the town. His smart brown eyes watched the world with a calmness that matched his owner's. Mark pulled the truck into Miller's gas station, a place that looked like it had been standing since the 1950s, complete with old-fashioned pumps and a squeaky sign swinging in the gentle breeze. He shut off the engine. The silence that followed felt heavy but peaceful. He stepped out, stretching his stiff body. His boots crunched on the gravel. He wore a plain gray t-shirt and worn jeans, clothes that helped him blend in. Though his straight posture and alert manner showed he was someone disciplined. He walked around to the passenger's side to let Max out. The dog jumped down smoothly, staying close to Mark's leg without being told. "Easy, buddy. Let's get some fuel and stretch our legs," Mark said quietly, patting the dog's solid side. While Mark pumped gas, he noticed a young woman cleaning the windshield of a car at the next pump. She looked about 20 years old with wheat-colored hair tied back in a messy ponytail and a face that showed gentle, tired kindness. She wore a faded uniform with the name Ashley sewn over the pocket. This was Ashley Reed. She worked with practiced skill, but there was a softness in her expression when she paused to look at Max. "That's a beautiful dog you have there," Ashley said in a friendly, musical voice. She set down her squeegee and walked over, wiping her hands on a rag. "I don't see many German shepherds around here that look so well-behaved." Mark gave a small, polite smile. "Thanks. His name is Max. He's been with me through a lot." Ashley knelt down slightly, holding out her hand for Max to sniff. The dog did so, wagging his tail slowly. "Hi, Max. You're a good boy, aren't you?" She looked up at Mark. "It's a hot day. Would he like some cold water? I have a bowl inside I keep for stray animals, but he looks far too noble to be a stray." "That would be appreciated, thank you," Mark replied. Ashley disappeared into the small store and came back moments later with a plastic bowl filled with cool water. She set it down, and Max drank gratefully. "I'm Ashley, by the way," she said, standing up and brushing a loose hair from her forehead. "Mark, just passing through," he replied, keeping his answer short but polite. "You work here every day?" Mark asked. "Mostly," Ashley sighed, a small cloud passing over her cheerful face. "Every shift I can get. My grandmother Martha, well, her medication isn't cheap, and her pension only goes so far. But she raised me, so it's the least I can do." Mark nodded, a flicker of respect appearing in his eyes. He recognized that tone. The quiet strength of someone fighting hard for someone else. That's honorable. Not many people would work this hard without complaining. Oh, I complain sometimes. Ashley laughed softly. But she's worth it. She tells the best stories about this town. Says it used to be quieter, if you can believe that. The moment was simple, grounded in shared humanity on a quiet afternoon. It was the kind of moment Mark had been searching for, a break from the noise and chaos of his past life. However, Silver Creek's peace was fragile. Just as the pump clicked off, the low rumble of powerful engines shattered the silence. The sound grew quickly from a distant hum to an aggressive roar. Mark stiffened instinctively, his hand moving near his waist before dropping to his side. 3 flashy sports cars, a red convertible, a neon green coupe, and a sleek black sedan, screeched into the gas station, kicking up clouds of dust and gravel. They took up multiple parking spots, blocking the exit for a rusty sedan driven by an elderly couple. Doors flew open, and a group of young men stepped out. They wore designer clothes that looked out of place in the dusty town, expensive sunglasses, and carried an air of arrogance you could almost feel. The driver of the red convertible, a tall, thin man with bleached blonde hair and a permanent sneer on his face, slammed his door shut. He didn't look at anyone. Instead, he cranked up his car stereo volume. Heavy bass thumped through the air, making the windows of the whole station vibrate and drowning out the peaceful sounds of the town. "Hey, we need premium, full tank, and make it snappy," the blond man shouted toward the shop, ignoring Ashley, who was standing right there. "And bring out some energy drinks, the good stuff, not whatever local trash you have." Ashley flinched at the noise and rudeness. The elderly couple in the block sedan looked terrified, the old man gripping the steering wheel with shaking hands. "Excuse me," Ashley said, her voice trembling slightly but trying to stay firm. "You're blocking the exit. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson need to leave." The leader of the group laughed, a harsh, grating sound. He walked over to Ashley, looming over her. "They can wait. We're in a hurry. We've got a party to get to, and we're not waiting for some ancient relics to move their junk heap." Mark watched the scene unfold, his expression darkening. The peace he'd found just moments ago had evaporated, replaced by rising tension. Max sensed the shift in his master's mood. The dog stopped drinking and stood at attention, a low rumble beginning deep in his chest. The contrast between the peaceful golden afternoon and the sudden harsh intrusion was stark. The sun still shone on Silver Creek, but the shadows seemed to have grown a little longer, a little sharper. The traveler had arrived seeking peace, but it seemed trouble had arrived at the exact same moment. The vibrations from the bass in the red convertible seemed to rattle the very teeth of the old gas pumps, creating a jarring clash against the peaceful backdrop of Silver Creek. The late afternoon sun, which had cast such a warm and inviting glow before, now felt harsh, glaring off the polished chrome and custom paint of the sports cars. Dust particles danced frantically in the air, stirred up by the aggressive arrival of the cars, settling on the sweaty skin of locals who watched with a mix of curiosity and worry. Ashley Reed, usually calm and composed, felt her hands trembling as she reached for the premium fuel nozzle. The pressure of the situation felt suffocating. The driver of the red car, the blond man who had shouted earlier, was watching her with hawk-like intensity that made her skin crawl. This was Brody Sterling. He was the picture of spoiled wealth, wearing a white linen suit that cost more than most people in town made in a year, and Italian leather loafers that had never touched a dirt road. His face was handsome in a standard way, but it was ruined by a permanent sneer of entitlement and eyes that held no warmth, only a calculation of worth based on money and possessions. "Careful with that," Brody snapped, leaning against his pristine car, tapping a gold ring against the door. "That paint is custom. You scratch it, you buy it. And trust me, sweetheart, you can't afford a lug nut on this ride." Ashley nodded nervously, murmuring an apology she didn't owe. Her focus was entirely on finishing the job quickly so they would leave. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She squeezed the handle, but her hand, slick with sweat and shaking from the verbal attack, slipped just as she pulled the nozzle away. A tiny splash of gasoline, no more than a few droplets, escaped the spout. It landed not on the paint, but near the wheel well, though a single drop might have grazed the pristine fender. The reaction was instant, and way out of proportion. Brody pushed himself off the car as if he'd been shot, his face twisting into a mask of ugly rage. "Are you blind?" he screamed, his voice cracking with fury. "Look what you did, you stupid, clumsy peasant. Do you have any idea what that does to the finish?" The sudden explosion of noise drew everyone's attention at the station. From the back of the black SUV that followed the sports cars, a mountain of a man stepped out. This was Vince, Brody's personal security guard. He stood nearly 6.5 feet tall. His neck was thick with muscle that strained against his black suit collar. He wore dark sunglasses even in the fading light, and his shaved head glistened with sweat. He didn't speak. He just folded his massive arms and scanned the area, a silent threat to anyone who might think of interfering. Inside the garage, Earl, the town's elderly mechanic with grease-stained overalls and a wrench in his hand, took a step forward. His protective instincts kicked in for Ashley, whom he'd known since she was a toddler. However, Vince simply shifted his weight and turned his dark lenses toward Earl. The sheer physical menace of the bodyguard froze the old mechanic in his tracks. Mrs. Henderson, still trapped in her sedan, rolled up her window with a shaking hand, her eyes wide with fear. The locals were paralyzed, not from cowardice, but from the overwhelming display of aggressive power that was so foreign to their way of life. Brody wasn't finished. He marched up to Ashley, invading her personal space until she was forced to back up against the pump. "I'm talking to you," he spat, pointing a manicured finger in her face. "You ruined it. You think sorry fixes this? You people are all the same. Useless trash living in the middle of nowhere." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick wad of $100 bills held together by a silver clip. With a look of pure disgust, he tore loose a handful of bills and threw them directly at Ashley's face. The paper fluttered down around her like green confetti, landing in the dirt and oil stains of the driveway. "There. That's more money than you've ever seen. Pick it up. Pick it up." Ashley stood frozen, tears welling in her eyes, humiliated beyond words. She didn't move to take the money. Her refusal seemed to make Brody angrier. He pointed down at his shoes. "You know what? Since you like making messes, you can clean one up. My shoes got dust on them when I got out, because you don't sweep this dump. Get on your knees and wipe them off. Now." The air at the station grew heavy. The tension stretched to a breaking point. Mark Thompson had been watching the entire exchange from near the front of his truck. He had remained motionless, his face a mask of calm, but his light brown eyes had darkened into cold stone. He'd seen men like Brody before, bullies who used power to crush those they thought beneath them. But when Brody, frustrated by Ashley's silence, raised his hand as if to strike her, the stillness in Mark shattered. He moved with a speed that contradicted his relaxed posture, crossing the distance between the pumps in a blur of motion. Just as Brody's hand began coming down toward Ashley's cheek, Mark was there. He didn't shout. He didn't shove. He simply reached out and clamped his hand around Brody's wrist. The grip was like iron, stopping the motion instantly. Brody gasped, his eyes widening in shock as he tried to yank his arm back. But Mark's fingers didn't budge. "That's enough," Mark said. His voice was low, without anger, but filled with absolute authority that cut through the bass of the music and all the noise. "We don't touch women. Not here, not anywhere." Brody stared at him, stunned. He looked at Vince, expecting his bodyguard to crush this stranger. But before Vince could take a step, a low, guttural sound vibrated through the air. Max, who had been waiting by the truck, had moved forward. The German shepherd stood between Mark and the bodyguard, his fur standing up, his lips curled back to reveal formidable white teeth. The dog didn't bark. He emitted a deep, continuous growl that promised violence if the threat continued. Max's eyes were locked onto Vince, and for the first time, the giant bodyguard hesitated, recognizing a trained protector when he saw one. Brody's face flushed deep red, a mix of pain from the crushing grip on his wrist and humiliation from being stopped. "Let go of me," Brody shrieked, his voice climbing higher. "Do you have any idea who I am? Do you know who my father is? One phone call, and I can buy this entire town and bulldoze it." Mark held his gaze for a second longer, letting the fear take root in Brody's eyes, before releasing his wrist with a dismissive shove. Brody stumbled back, rubbing his arm, his bravado crumbling into childish petulance. "You're dead," Brody hissed, retreating toward his car while keeping a wary eye on Max. "You hear me? You're a dead man. Nobody touches a Sterling." He scrambled into the driver's seat, slamming the door. The other drivers, sensing the shift in power, hurried to their vehicles. Vince gave Max one last calculating look before getting back into the SUV. Engines roared to life, tires squealed against the pavement, and the cars peeled out of the station, leaving behind a cloud of exhaust and the lingering smell of burnt rubber. The golden hour had faded into bruised purple twilight, the shadows lengthening across the concrete of Miller's gas station. The station, which had been a hive of aggression only an hour before, now sat in uneasy silence, the kind that usually comes before a storm. Mark Thompson hadn't left. He'd moved his truck to a parking spot on the far side of the lot, hood up, pretending to check the oil, but his eyes never left the front entrance. Max sat in the passenger seat, his ears perked forward, watching the road. The arrival of law enforcement should have been a relief, a signal that order was being restored. But when the black and white police car rolled into the lot, Mark felt a knot of suspicion tighten in his gut. The car didn't arrive with lights and sirens. It prowled in like a shark sensing blood. The door opened, and out stepped Sheriff Jim Barron. He was a man who carried his weight poorly, his beige uniform straining at the buttons around his belly. A wide-brimmed hat cast a shadow over a face that was red, flushed, and sweaty. He had the look of a man who enjoyed the perks of his office far more than the responsibilities. He didn't look at Mark or the spot where the incident had occurred. He marched straight into the office, his heavy boots thudding with authority. Mark lowered the hood of his truck quietly and wiped his hands on a rag, stepping closer to the open garage bay to listen. He could hear voices raised inside, not an argument, but in one-sided command. Through the glass, he saw Mr. Miller, the station owner, a balding man with a kind face but weak spine, wringing his hands nervously. Sheriff Barron was leaning over the counter, pointing a thick finger at Miller, then gesturing aggressively toward Ashley, who stood by the register looking small and defeated. The conversation was muffled, but the body language was clear. Minutes later, the sheriff walked out, hitched up his belt, and gave Ashley a final dismissive glare before getting back into his car and driving off, not once asking for a witness statement. Ashley stepped out of the office a moment later. She wasn't wearing her uniform anymore. She was in a simple floral blouse and jeans, carrying a cardboard box filled with her few personal belongings. Her shoulders were slumped. The strength she'd shown earlier was finally crushed under the weight of injustice. Mark approached her slowly, Max trotting by his side. "Let me guess," Mark said, his voice low and sympathetic. "The sheriff wasn't here to take a report on the assault." Ashley looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and swimming with fresh tears. She let out a shaky, bitter laugh. "Mr. Miller fired me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Sheriff Barron said the Sterling family called. They claimed I was hostile to VIP tourists, and that keeping me employed was a threat to the town's image. He said if Miller didn't let me go, the station would face surprise health and safety inspections every week." She wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. "I need this job, Mark. Grandma's medication refill is due on Tuesday." Mark felt a surge of cold anger, but he kept his face neutral for her sake. "Get in," he said, nodding toward his truck. "I'll drive you home. You shouldn't be walking with that box, not with those guys still in town." Ashley hesitated for a second, then looked at Max, who gave a soft whine and nudged her hand. "Okay," she said softly. "Thank you." The drive to Ashley's home was quiet. The town of Silver Creek, beautiful in daylight, now felt oppressive in the dim evening light. They drove past closed storefronts and flickering street lamps until the paved road turned to gravel, leading them to the outskirts of town. Ashley's house was a small, single-story cottage with white siding that had grayed with age. The porch sagged slightly on the left, and the roof had been patched in several places. But the yard was spotlessly kept. Flower pots made from old tires were painted bright colors and overflowing with marigolds and petunias, proof of someone's love and care. "It's not much," Ashley murmured as Mark parked the truck. "It's home," Mark replied simply. He grabbed her box and followed her up the creaking steps. The front door opened before they could knock, revealing Martha. She was a woman in her late 70s, frail as a bird but with eyes that were sharp and clear, the same shade of blue as Ashley's. She wore a hand-knitted shawl over her shoulders and leaned on a cane, but her smile was warm enough to light up the darkening porch. "I heard a truck that didn't sound like Earl's," Martha said, her voice raspy but spirited. She looked from Ashley to Mark, and then to the box in Mark's hands. Her smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of knowing concern, but she didn't pry immediately. "And who is this handsome gentleman and his wolf?" she asked, gesturing to Max. "This is Mark, Grandma," Ashley said, trying to sound cheerful. "And Max. They gave me a ride home." Martha stepped back, opening the door wide. "Well, don't just stand there letting the mosquitoes in. Come inside. I was just setting the table for stew, and the Lord knows I always make too much for two." The inside of the house was like stepping into a time capsule. It smelled of lavender, old paper, and savory beef stew. The furniture was mismatched and worn, covered in crochet doilies, and the walls were lined with framed photographs of people long gone. It was cozy, safe, and undeniably poor, but it held a richness of spirit that Mark hadn't felt in years. Dinner was a simple meal, but for Mark it felt like a feast. The stew was thick and hearty, served with crusty bread. Martha sat at the head of the small round table, asking Mark about his travels, listening with genuine interest, while Max slept contentedly on a rug near the fireplace. For a brief hour, the ugly events at the gas station seemed to fade. Mark watched the way Ashley cared for her grandmother, filling her water glass and cutting her bread, and he saw the deep, unbreakable bond between them. It was a stark contrast to the cold, tactical world he'd lived in for so long. "You have kind eyes, Mark," Martha said suddenly, breaking a pause in the conversation. "Sad but kind. It takes a good man to stop for a stranger." Mark looked down at his plate and used to such direct praise. "I just did what anyone would do, ma'am." Martha shook her head slowly. "No, son. These days, most people would just drive on by. You didn't." The atmosphere of warmth and safety was shattered in an instant. A deafening crash echoed through the small room as the front window exploded inward. Shards of glass sprayed across the wooden floor, glittering like dangerous diamonds in the lamplight. Martha screamed, covering her head, and Ashley dropped her spoon, freezing in terror. Mark was out of his chair before the first piece of glass hit the ground. He tackled Ashley and Martha, shielding them with his body as a heavy object skidded across the floor and came to rest against the base of the sofa. Max was instantly on his feet, barking a ferocious, thunderous warning at the broken window, his body tense and ready to attack. "Stay down," Mark commanded, his voice shifting instantly into combat mode. He waited a heartbeat, listening for follow-up movement, footsteps, a second throw, a gunshot. But there was only the sound of a car engine revving high and speeding away into the night. Mark slowly lifted his head, checking that the women were unharmed. Ashley was shaking, clutching her grandmother's hand. Mark stood up, crunching over the glass, and approached the object on the floor. It was a red brick, rough and heavy. Wrapped around it with a thick rubber band was a piece of expensive, heavy paper, hotel stationery. Mark pulled the paper free and unfolded it. The message was scrawled in black marker, the handwriting jagged and angry. "Leave town or we bury you. Nobody says no to a sterling." Mark stared at the note, his jaw tightening until a muscle twitched in his cheek. This wasn't just a spoiled brat throwing a tantrum anymore. This was a calculated campaign of terror against two defenseless women. He looked back at Ashley, who was weeping softly while hugging her terrified grandmother, and then at the gaping hole in the window where the safety of their home had been violated. The traveler had intended to move on, to keep driving until the road ran out. But as he crumpled the note in his fist, Mark knew he wasn't going anywhere. The war had just come to Silver Creek, and he was the only one who knew how to fight it. The echo of the shattered glass seemed to linger in the small cottage long after Mark had swept away the shards. He'd found a sheet of plywood in a shed out back and hammered it over the broken window. The rhythmic thud of the hammer acted like a grim heartbeat in the silent night. Ashley and Martha were seated at the kitchen table, clutching mugs of warm tea, their faces pale. Mark finished the repair and turned to them, his whole manner having shifted. The drifter was gone. The soldier had taken his place. He moved with calculated precision, checking the locks on the front and back doors, reinforcing the flimsy deadbolt on the back entrance with a wedge of wood he made from a scrap block. He wasn't frantic. He was methodical, a professional securing a perimeter. When Ashley suggested he leave to avoid further trouble, Mark simply shook his head. "I don't walk away from a fight," he told her, his voice steady and low. "And I certainly don't leave people behind. I'm staying until this is finished." He spent the rest of the night on the faded floral sofa, fully clothed, boots on, with one eye open, while Max slept by the bedroom door, a fuzzy guard protecting the women. The next morning brought deceptive calm. The sun rose over Silver Creek as if the violence of the previous night had been a bad dream. But the plywood on the window was a stark reminder of reality. While Martha rested, Mark took Ashley into the backyard. The grass was wet with dew, and the air smelled of pine and damp earth. "They rely on fear," Mark explained, standing opposite her. "They want you to freeze. I'm going to teach you how not to." For the next hour, he walked her through simple, effective self-defense techniques. He taught her how to break a wrist grip by rotating against the thumb, how to use her palm to strike the nose, and most importantly, how to turn her fear into fuel. Ashley was hesitant at first, her movements soft, but Mark was patient. He saw the steel beneath her gentle exterior. By the end of the session, she was breathing hard, her eyes focused and alert. Nearby on the porch, Max sat next to Martha's rocking chair. The old woman's hand rested on the dog's broad head, her fingers burying themselves in his thick fur. Max, usually aloof with strangers, leaned into her touch, offering silent, steady comfort. He followed Martha everywhere she went that morning, his eyes tracking her every move, establishing a bond that went beyond training. He had adopted her as part of his pack. As afternoon faded into evening, Mark's focus shifted from defense to offense. He knew that sitting and waiting to be attacked was a losing strategy. He needed information. "Stay inside tonight," Mark instructed Ashley, handing her a heavy flashlight. "Lock the doors. Max stays with you. If anyone tries to get in, Max will know long before they reach the door. I'm going to see what our friends are up to." Leaving his truck hidden behind the shed to avoid drawing attention, Mark set out on foot. He moved through the woods that bordered the town, blending into the shadows like a ghost. He wore dark clothing and moved with the silent, rolling walk of a man who had tracked high-value targets in the mountains of Afghanistan. The noise led him to them. It wasn't hard to find. The Sterling boy had rented the Eagle's Nest, a sprawling modern glass and steel villa perched on a hill overlooking the town, usually reserved for corporate retreats or weddings. Mark approached the property from the tree line, avoiding the main driveway where security lights blazed. He climbed a sturdy oak tree that offered a vantage point looking down onto the villa's expansive patio. Even from 100 yards away, the smell of excess was strong. The music was thumping, chaotic noise that disturbed the wildlife for miles. Through a pair of compact, high-powered binoculars he retrieved from his tactical vest, Mark scanned the scene. There were about a dozen people, mostly young men and women in swimwear and expensive evening clothes, drinking heavily. Brody was in the center of it all, holding court on a lounge chair like a king on a throne. But as Mark adjusted the focus, the situation grew darker. On a glass table in the center of the group, lines of blue powder were laid out. This wasn't just alcohol or marijuana. They were passing around bags of synthetic drugs. Mark retrieved a small listening device from his pack, a piece of surplus gear he kept for hunting, though tonight he was hunting a different kind of prey. He pointed it toward the patio, adjusting the settings until the voices cut through the music. "You should have seen her face," Brody was saying, his speech slurred and rapid, frantic from the drugs. Little peasant girl thought she could cry her way out of it. A new person, a thin man with nervous energy and a jagged tattoo on his neck named Skinner, laughed nervously. "But that guy, Brody, the drifter, he looked serious. Maybe we should just let it go." We leave in 2 days anyway. Brody's face twisted into a snarl. He stood up, kicking a chair over. Let it go. No one grabs me. No one. I'm not just going to run them out. Tonight, we're going to light up their world. He leaned in closer to his followers, his voice dropping to a sinister whisper that the microphone barely caught. I've got the fuel in the trunk. We go down there at 2 a.m. We torch the shed out back. Once the fire spreads to the house, they'll run. And when they run, we'll be waiting to record it. It'll be the viral video of the year. Mark lowered the binoculars, a cold chill settling in his stomach that had nothing to do with the night air. This wasn't just bullying anymore. It wasn't even just assault. Brody was planning arson, potentially attempted murder, fueled by a chemical high that stripped away any sense of right and wrong. The blue powder Mark saw was likely a potent synthetic stimulant known to cause aggression and paranoia. The threat level had just jumped from dangerous to deadly. Mark checked his watch. It was 11 p.m. He had 3 hours before they made their move. He packed his gear silently, his mind racing through tactical options. He couldn't call the sheriff. Barron was in their pocket. He was alone. As he slipped down the tree and melted back into the darkness of the forest, Mark knew he had to turn the hunter into the hunted. He wouldn't just defend the cottage. He was going to intercept them before they ever struck the match. The clock on the microwave in Ashley's kitchen read 1 a.m. The house was submerged in heavy, expectant silence, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the cooling wood stove and the soft breathing of Martha, who had finally fallen into a restless sleep in the back room. Mark Thompson sat in the dark living room, his silhouette blending with the shadows. He wasn't asleep. He was in a state of active rest, his senses tuned to the environment. Max lay by his feet, his ears swiveling occasionally toward the road. The trap came exactly as Mark had anticipated, though clumsier than he expected. A loud metallic crunch of twisting metal echoed from the road about 200 yards away, followed immediately by the blaring of a car horn stuck on. It was a classic distress signal, designed to trigger a good person's response. Moments later, heavy footsteps pounded on the front porch. A man's voice, rough and fake with panic, shouted through the door. Help. Someone help. My truck ran off the road. My friend is trapped. Ashley, startled awake on the sofa, scrambled to her feet. Her instinct to help kicked in. She reached for the door lock, but Mark's hand gently but firmly stopped hers. Don't, he whispered, his eyes locked on the door. It's a trick. Ashley froze, looking at him with wide, frightened eyes. But what if? Mark shook his head. There are no skid marks. I didn't hear brakes before the crash, just the impact. They pushed the car into the ditch. He turned to Max guard. The command was soft but absolute. The German shepherd stood up, his posture stiffening, and moved to position himself between Ashley and the back hallway leading to Martha's room. Mark checked his watch. I'm going out there. They expect me to come running blindly. I'm going to give them what they want, but on my terms. Lock this door behind me. Do not open it for anyone but me. If they come in, let Max handle it. Mark slipped out the back door, melting into the darkness of the yard. Instead of running toward the accident on the main road, he circled wide through the neighbor's overgrown orchard, coming around from the side. As he approached the roadside ditch, he saw the setup. An old sedan had been pushed nose first into the drainage ditch, its horn wailing into the night. 3 men were waiting in the shadows of an alleyway formed by 2 abandoned storefronts, clearly the ambush point. These weren't college kids. These were hired muscle. Leading them was a man who looked like he'd been carved from rough stone. This was Rico, a local enforcer known for bar brawls and debt collection. He wore a dirty denim vest over a thick hoodie, his knuckles scarred and tattooed, and he held a length of lead pipe loosely in his right hand. Flanking him were 2 younger thugs, eager but inexperienced, holding chains. Mark stepped out of the shadows, not running, but walking with a terrifyingly calm stride. He stopped 10 feet from them. You can stop the horn, Mark said, his voice cutting through the noise. Nobody's coming. Rico jumped slightly, then sneered, stepping into the light. Well, look at this. The hero showed up. The rich kid paid good money for you to have a walking accident. Soldier boy. Rico swung the pipe into his palm, with a menacing smack. "Just stay down, and maybe you keep your teeth." Mark didn't assume a fighting stance. He simply relaxed his shoulders. "Go home, Rico. The money isn't worth what's about to happen to you." Rico laughed, a harsh, barking sound, and lunged forward, swinging the pipe in a wide, vicious arc aimed at Mark's head. The fight was over almost before it began. Mark didn't block. He stepped inside the arc of the weapon, his movement fluid and precise. He caught Rico's wrist with one hand and drove his elbow into the man's stomach with the other. The air left Rico's lungs in a wheezing gasp. Mark pivoted, using Rico's own momentum to flip him over his hip, slamming him onto the hard pavement. Before the other two could react, Mark had twisted Rico's arm behind his back, applying just enough pressure to dislocate the shoulder if he moved. "Stay," Mark ordered. The two younger thugs hesitated, fear flickering in their eyes as they saw their leader taken down in seconds. Mark looked up, his light brown eyes cold. "Run," he suggested. They dropped their chains and fled into the night. Mark leaned down to Rico, who was groaning in pain. "Where are they?" Mark asked. Rico, wheezing, pointed toward Ashley's house. "The back. They wanted the dog. Said they were going to skin it." A jolt of adrenaline, sharper than any combat drug, surged through Mark. He left Rico writhing on the ground and sprinted back toward the cottage, cutting through the woods. Meanwhile, inside the cottage, the real nightmare was unfolding. While the distraction played out in front, the back door frame, weakened by age, splintered with a loud crack as a crowbar forced the lock. Ashley screamed, backing into the kitchen, grabbing a heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove. 3 figures stumbled into the kitchen, smelling of sweat and chemical energy. It was Brody, flanked by 2 of his college friends, Tyler and Chad. Tyler was a nervous, wiry young man holding an animal control pole, his hands shaking. Chad was a bulky linebacker type holding a baseball bat, looking pumped up but unsure. Brody, his eyes wide and pupils huge from the drugs, held a hunting knife. "Where is it?" Brody hissed, scanning the room frantically. "Where's the mutt? I'm going to mount his head on my wall." He looked at Ashley, a cruel grin spreading across his face. "And you're going to watch." Ashley retreated until her back hit the refrigerator. "Get out," she screamed. "I'm calling the police." She fumbled with her cell phone, her fingers trembling uncontrollably. She hit speed dial for 911 and pressed the phone to her ear. "Beep, beep, beep. All circuits are busy. Please try your call again later." The automated voice was like a death sentence. The storm earlier in the week had damaged the local lines, and the system was overloaded or down. She was alone. "Nobody's coming, sweetheart," Brody laughed, stepping closer. "Now give me the dog. I'm right here." A low growl seemed to come from the shadows of the living room. It wasn't a human voice. It was the sound of a predator. Max emerged from the darkness. He didn't bark. He didn't charge wildly. He moved with a low, stalking walk, his belly close to the ground, his ears pinned flat against his skull. The fur along his spine stood up in a stiff ridge. "Get him, Tyler. Use the pole," Brody shouted, shoving his friend forward. Tyler lunged with the catch pole, trying to loop it over Max's head. Max moved with lightning speed, ducking under the loop and clamping his jaws onto the pole itself. With a violent jerk of his powerful neck, Max ripped the pole from Tyler's grip and tossed it aside. In the same motion, he launched himself at Chad, who swung the bat. Max dodged the clumsy swing and slammed his full body weight into Chad's chest. The linebacker went down with a crash, the bat skittering across the floor. Max didn't maul him. He delivered a single controlled bite to the forearm, enough to crush muscle and cause immense pain without severing the artery, then released and turned his attention to the leader. Chad curled into a ball, sobbing. Tyler was pressed against the wall, hyperventilating, refusing to move. That left Brody. The rich boy stood alone in the center of the kitchen, the knife trembling in his hand. Max stood between Brody and Ashley. The dog's teeth were bared, glistening with saliva. His eyes were locked onto Brody's throat. He took a slow, deliberate step forward. Growl. Another step. Growl. Brody backed up, his arrogance evaporating into pure terror. He waved the knife frantically. "Stay back. I'll cut you. I swear I'll cut you." Max didn't flinch. He was a SEAL dog. He'd faced insurgents with assault rifles. A drug-addled boy with a knife was nothing. He coiled his muscles, ready to spring. Brody, realizing he was outmatched by a force of nature he couldn't buy off or bully, stumbled backward, tripping over a kitchen chair and falling hard onto his back. He scrambled into the corner, kicking his legs out. "Help! Somebody get this thing off me!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. Max stood over him, his muzzle inches from Brody's face, holding him hostage with sheer intimidation. Ashley, still clutching the phone with the busy signal droning in her ear, lowered the skillet. She looked at the scene, the chaotic intrusion neutralized not by weapons, but by the disciplined fury of a loyal guardian. The back door slammed open again, and Mark stood there, chest heaving slightly, taking in the scene. He looked at the cowering thugs, then at Brody trembling in the corner under Max's watch, and finally at Ashley. "Checkmate," Mark said quietly. The air in the kitchen, thick with the tension of a cornered predator, was suddenly broken by a chaotic wash of blinding red and blue lights. The wail of sirens, which had been suspiciously absent during Ashley's desperate call to 911, now screamed from the driveway, announcing the arrival of authority with overwhelming force. Mark Thompson stood in the doorway, his chest heaving slightly from his sprint back from the ambush. But the word "checkmate" had barely left his lips when the story twisted violently. Sheriff Jim Barron didn't kick the door down. He strode in through the open frame with his weapon drawn, followed closely by 2 deputies and an animal control officer armed with a heavy-duty catch pole. But they weren't aiming at the intruders. The barrels of their guns were pointed directly at Mark. "Hands where I can see them. Now," Barron bellowed, his face a mask of fake outrage. The scene in the kitchen was a picture of confusion. Brody, seeing his rescue, instantly collapsed from his cowering position against the wall, clutching his leg and letting out a dramatic, agonizing scream. "He set the wolf on me. Help! They're crazy. He tried to rip my throat out." The transformation was instant. The arrogant bully dissolved into a sobbing victim. Tyler and Chad, taking their cue, dropped to their knees, hands raised in fake surrender, shouting about how they'd just come to check on the noise and were attacked by a wild beast. Mark's combat instincts flared. He calculated the distance to Barron, the angle of the deputies, the escape routes. But he extinguished the thought immediately. Violence against law enforcement, even corrupt ones, was a line he would not cross. It would only prove Brody's lies and put Ashley in more danger. Slowly, deliberately, Mark raised his open palms to shoulder height. "Sheriff, look at the room," Mark said, his voice calm and authoritative, cutting through Brody's wailing. "These men broke in. Look at the broken lock. Look at the weapons on the floor." Barron didn't look. He didn't even glance at the shattered door frame or the baseball bat lying near Chad. He marched up to Mark, grabbed his shoulder, and spun him around, slamming him against the refrigerator. "I see a dangerous drifter and his vicious animal assaulting the son of a state senator," Barron spat, snapping handcuffs onto Mark's wrists with excessive force. "You have the right to remain silent, and I suggest you use it." Across the room, another tragedy was unfolding. The animal control officer lunged for Max. The German shepherd snarled, ready to defend his master. But Mark barked a sharp command. "Max, stand down. Heel." The dog froze, his ears flattening, confused but obedient to the core. The officer slipped the wire noose over Max's head and tightened it cruelly, dragging the compliant animal out the back door toward a caged truck. "No, please don't hurt him." Ashley cried out, rushing forward, but a deputy intercepted her, grabbing her wrists. "You're under arrest for helping with an assault, Miss Reed," the deputy recited mechanically. Ashley looked at Mark, her eyes wide with terror and betrayal, tears streaming down her face. Mark locked eyes with her, trying to project as much reassurance as he could while being shoved toward the door. "Stay calm, Ashley. Say nothing. It's going to be all right." Outside, the cool night air did nothing to ease the heat of injustice. Mark was patted down roughly against the hood of the police car. Barron pulled Mark's wallet from his pocket, flipping it open to reveal his military ID card. He paused for a fraction of a second, his flashlight beam showing the rank of lieutenant commander and the sealed trident symbol. "I am an active duty officer," Mark stated, his voice like steel. "I require you to contact my commanding officer at Naval Special Warfare Command immediately." "You are making a mistake, Sheriff." Barron stared at the ID, a flicker of hesitation crossing his eyes. But then he looked over at Brody, who was being attended to by paramedics for a scratch that barely broke the skin. The sheriff made his choice. He scoffed, closing the wallet and shoving it into his own pocket. "Looks fake to me. We get a lot of stolen valor types drifting through here. You can make your phone call from the cell, Commander." He confiscated Mark's phone as well, tossing it into an evidence bag. The ride to the station was silent, the back of the police car smelling of stale coffee and disinfectant. The Silver Creek Police Station was a small brick building that felt more like a bunker than a place of public service. Mark was processed with humiliating thoroughness, fingerprinted, photographed, and stripped of his belt and shoelaces before being shoved into a holding cell. Ashley was placed in a separate cell down the hall. Mark could hear her quiet sobbing, a sound that fueled a cold, hard rage in his chest. He sat on the metal bench, closing his eyes, replaying the events, organizing his mind. He wasn't trapped. He was simply in a new theater of operations. An hour later, the heavy steel door of the cell block opened. The clicking of expensive dress shoes echoed on the concrete floor. Sheriff Barron appeared, unlocking Mark's cell, but not gesturing for him to leave. Instead, he stepped aside to admit a tall, imposing man. This was Senator Harlan Sterling. He was a man in his 60s who wore power like a second skin. His silver hair was styled to perfection, and his charcoal suit was tailored immaculately to hide the softness of his age. He smelled of expensive cologne and old money. His face was smooth, likely the result of cosmetic work, but his eyes were hard, calculating chips of gray that lacked any trace of empathy. He didn't look like a worried father. He looked like a cleaner arriving to mop up a mess. Barron brought in a metal chair, and Sterling sat down, placing a leather briefcase on the small table bolted to the floor. He looked at Mark with a mixture of pity and disdain. "Mr. Thompson," Sterling began, his voice a smooth, practiced tone that had charmed thousands of voters. "What a difficult position you found yourself in. Assault with a deadly weapon, trespassing, endangering welfare. The list is quite extensive." Mark sat still, his posture upright, meeting the senator's gaze with an intensity that made the politician blink. "Your son broke into a woman's home with a knife and a baseball bat," Mark said evenly. "He was high on synthetic drugs. I stopped him from committing murder." Sterling laughed softly, a dry, humorless sound. He opened his briefcase and slid a single sheet of paper across the table, along with a gold pen. "That is a fascinating story, but unfortunately, it is not the one that will be told. My son is a high-spirited young man, perhaps a bit reckless, but he is a victim here. This document is a confession. It states that you, suffering from post-traumatic stress, had a violent episode and attacked these boys without reason. If you sign it, I will pull some strings. You will be released into the custody of a VA hospital in another state. The charges will be dropped, and Miss Reed will be let go with a warning." He let the threat hang in the air, smiling thinly. "If you don't, well, let's just say prison is a very dark place for a man with no friends." Mark looked at the paper, then back at Sterling. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Slowly, Mark leaned forward. He didn't pick up the pen. "You think you can clean this up like you clean up a spilled drink," Mark said, his voice low and dangerous. "But you don't know what your son is. He isn't just high-spirited, Senator. He's a predator. I heard him tonight. I saw the drugs at the Eagle's Nest. I know about the arson plan." Sterling's smile faltered for the first time. "You have no proof. It's your word against the future of this state." "I am a United States Navy SEAL," Mark said, the words ringing with absolute conviction. "My word has weight, but I don't need just my word." Mark leaned back, his eyes locking onto Sterling's, with a predatory gleam of his own. "You took my phone, But you didn't check the cloud upload from a device I planted in the woods. You are raising a monster, Senator. And unless you want the entire world to see the video of your son conspiring to burn 2 women alive in their sleep, you will unlock this door, release Ashley, and bring my dog back. Now." The silence in the interrogation room was heavy, a suffocating blanket that seemed to absorb the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. Senator Harlan Sterling sat across from Mark, his manicured fingers drumming rhythmically on the leather briefcase. He had dismissed Mark's threat about the cloud upload with a scoff, believing it to be the desperate bluff of a man with no options. To Sterling, the world operated on leverage, and he believed he held all of it. Mark, however, remained unnervingly calm. He leaned back in the metal chair, the handcuffs biting into his wrists, but his posture was that of a commander in a briefing room, not a prisoner. "You think I'm bluffing, Senator," Mark said, his voice level. "You think because you took my phone, you cut off my line to the outside world. But you made a mistake. You looked at my dog and saw a pet. You should have looked closer." Sterling paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What are you talking about?" he asked, a flicker of uncertainty breaking his composed mask. "Max isn't just a German shepherd," Mark explained, his light brown eyes locking onto the senator's. "He is a retired military working dog, a Tier 1 asset. The collar he wears isn't leather from a pet store. It's a K-9 tactical awareness system. It has a high-definition camera, a microphone array, and health sensors. It records on a loop, and when it detects a combat stress spike, like a break-in or a fight, it automatically uploads the footage to a secure, encrypted Department of Defense cloud server via satellite link." Mark shifted his gaze to Barron, who was leaning against the door looking bored. "You can confiscate my phone, Sheriff, but you can't scrub a server in the Pentagon." Barron let out a harsh laugh. "Listen to this guy. He watches too many movies." But Sterling didn't laugh. The color began to drain from his face, leaving his skin a pasty gray. He knew technology. He knew surveillance. And he knew that if Mark was telling the truth, the story he had carefully constructed was about to go up in flames. Before Sterling could formulate a response, the ground beneath them seemed to vibrate. It wasn't an earthquake. It was the heavy, rhythmic thrum of powerful engines idling outside, followed by the distinct sound of synchronized boots hitting the pavement. The front door of the police station didn't just open. It was flung wide with a force that rattled the hinges. A booming voice echoed down the hallway, cutting through the stale air of the station. "Secure the perimeter. I want this building locked down tight." Sheriff Barron's eyes went wide. He drew his weapon halfway, shouting, "Hey, you can't just barge in here," and stormed out of the interrogation room into the main lobby. Mark smiled grimly. He knew that voice. It belonged to Colonel Samuel Ironhide Graves. Moments later, the door to the interrogation room was pushed open again, but this time Barron was walking backward, his hands raised, his face pale. Stepping into the room was Colonel Graves, a man who looked like he'd been chiseled from granite. He was in his 50s with a buzz cut graying at the temples and a jagged scar running from his jawline to his neck, a souvenir from a deployment in Fallujah. He wore the full-service dress uniform of the U.S. Army, complete with a chest full of ribbons, and he radiated an aura of absolute, unshakable command. Behind him stood 2 military police officers, towering figures in tactical gear, armed with rifles held at the low ready. "Sheriff," Graves barked, his voice gravelly and sharp, "you are currently detaining a lieutenant commander of the United States Navy SEALs without notifying his command. That is a direct violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice and federal law. Step away from the prisoner." Barron stammered, looking to Senator Sterling for support. "Now wait a minute. We have jurisdiction here. This man assaulted a civilian." Graves ignored him and turned to Mark. "Commander Thompson, my apologies for the delay. The automated distress signal from K-9 Max's collar flagged a code red at 0200 hours. We mobilized from Fort Benning immediately." Graves motioned to one of the MPs. "Get those cuffs off him. Now." The MP moved swiftly, using a bolt cutter to snap the chain when Barron refused to produce the key. Mark rubbed his wrists, standing to his full height. "Good to see you, Colonel. We have a situation." Senator Sterling stood up, trying to salvage his authority. "Colonel, I am Senator Harlan Sterling. I demand to know." "I know exactly who you are, Senator." Graves cut him off, his eyes cold. "And I know who your son is, because I just watched a very interesting movie on the ride over." Graves placed a ruggedized military laptop on the metal table and opened it. He spun it around so that Sterling, Barron, and the newly arrived expensive lawyer Sterling had summoned could see the screen. Commander Thompson wasn't bluffing. "The upload completed 20 minutes ago. I suggest you watch closely." Graves hit the enter key. The screen flickered to life. The footage was shaky at first, the low angle providing a dog's eye view of the world. It showed the interior of Ashley's kitchen, dark and shadowy. Then the audio kicked in, crystal clear, the sound of wood splintering as the door was kicked in. The terrified scream of Ashley. The camera whipped around as Max moved, focusing on 3 figures. The lighting was low, but the night vision capability of the lens rendered the intruders in eerie green detail. There was Brody, clear as day, holding a hunting knife. "Where is it? Where's the mutt? I'm going to mount his head on my wall." Brody's voice rang out from the laptop speakers, distorted by rage, but undeniably him. The video continued, capturing the sheer terror in Ashley's voice as she begged them to leave. Then the key moment, Brody lunging, the other 2 attacking, and Max's disciplined defense. The camera captured the drugs falling from Brody's pocket during the scuffle, small bags of blue powder scattering on the floor. It captured Brody's breakdown, his cowardly screams when cornered, and his admission of the arson plot as he babbled in fear. "We were just going to burn the shed. I didn't mean to hurt anyone." The video ended with Mark's arrival and the sheriff bursting in. It showed the sheriff's immediate bias, his refusal to look at the evidence, and the rough handling of a compliant Max. The room fell into deathly silence. The only sound was the whirring of the laptop fan. Senator Sterling stared at the black screen, his mouth slightly open. The facade of the powerful, untouchable politician had cracked. He wasn't looking at a misunderstanding. He was looking at multiple felonies captured in high definition: armed burglary, assault, possession of drugs, conspiracy to commit arson, and filing a false police report. Mark leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. "That video is now on a secure server, Senator. It's been copied to 3 different locations. You can't buy it. You can't bury it. And you certainly can't threaten it away." Mark's voice was soft, but it carried the weight of a judge passing sentence. "You called me a drifter. You called Ashley a peasant. But right now, you're just the father of a criminal." Sterling slumped into his chair, looking suddenly very old. He looked at the lawyer, who simply closed his notebook and shook his head, signaling that there was no defense for this. Sheriff Barron, realizing his career was effectively over, backed into the corner, trying to make himself invisible. "Colonel," Mark said, turning to Graves, "I want my dog back, and I want Miss Reed released immediately. All charges dropped." "Already done, Commander," Graves replied with a sharp nod. "The MPs are retrieving the K-9 from animal control as we speak, and I have a Judge Advocate General on the line who is very interested in discussing civil rights violations with Sheriff Barron." The rescue was complete, not with bullets, but with the undeniable, blinding light of truth. Mark walked out of the interrogation room, leaving the senator in the ruins of his arrogance. He walked into the lobby just as Ashley was being led out of her cell. She looked tired and scared, but when she saw Mark, free and flanked by soldiers who treated him with reverence, her relief broke through in a fresh wave of tears. She didn't need to ask if it was over. The way Mark held himself told her everything. The nightmare was ending, and the sun was about to rise on a very different Silver Creek. The first rays of sunlight that broke over the eastern ridge of Silver Creek didn't just chase away the shadows of night. They seemed to scrub the town clean of a grime that had been building for years. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew-soaked grass and the promise of a new beginning. Outside the police station, the scene was one of controlled chaos, but this time justice was the architect. The arrival of the state police, coordinated by Colonel Graves, had turned the tables completely. Captain Reynolds, a stern officer with a jawline like a cliff edge and eyes that missed nothing, had taken command of the precinct. He stood by the entrance, watching as his troopers escorted a handcuffed Brody Sterling and his two accomplices into the back of a state transport van. Brody was no longer the swaggering prince of the town. He was weeping openly, his designer clothes rumpled, looking every bit the scared child who had played a game he didn't understand. The video from Max's collar had already been reviewed by the district attorney, and the charges were non-negotiable. Inside the station, the dismantling of the old power structure was swift and brutal. Sheriff Jim Barron was stripped of his badge and gun in the middle of the lobby, a humiliation witnessed by his own deputies. He was suspended pending a federal investigation into corruption and obstruction of justice. But the biggest blow fell on Senator Harlan Sterling. As he walked out of the station to his waiting car, he was met not by a respectful driver, but by a swarm of news vans that had descended on the town like vultures. The footage had leaked, as digital things tend to do, and the image of his son threatening to burn down a house, coupled with the senator's attempt to cover it up, was playing on every morning news channel in the country. He pushed through the reporters without a word, his face a mask of ash, knowing that his political career had effectively ended in that interrogation room. He resigned 48 hours later, citing personal family health reasons, a phrase that fooled no one. For Ashley Reed, the sunrise brought a different kind of shock. She sat on her front porch wrapped in a blanket, watching Max chase a stick in the yard. The fear that had gripped her for days was gone, replaced by a surreal sense of peace. Later that afternoon, a representative from the Sterling family's legal team, a different lawyer, this one humble and apologetic, arrived at the cottage. He presented settlement offer, a substantial sum intended to cover emotional distress and property damage in exchange for avoiding a civil lawsuit. It was an admission of guilt in all but name. Ashley stared at the check. It was enough to fix the windows, repair the roof, and pay for Martha's medication for the next 5 years. It was enough to dream again. "I'm not just going to fix the house," she told Mark as they sat in the kitchen later, sharing a pot of coffee. "I'm going to open that small grocery store I always talked about. A place where locals can buy fresh food without driving to the city. A place where everyone is treated with respect." Mark smiled, a rare, genuine expression that reached his light brown eyes. "That sounds like a good plan, Ashley. The town needs that." He looked around the small kitchen, which no longer felt like a fortress under siege, but a home again. "You're going to be fine here." Martha, who had been listening from her rocking chair, beckoned Mark over. Her hands, gnarled with age but warm and steady, took his large, calloused hands in hers. "You're leaving, aren't you?" she asked softly. Mark nodded. "Road's calling, ma'am. Max and we don't stay in one place too long." Martha pulled him down so she could kiss his cheek. "You came to us like a stranger, but you leave as family. You're a guardian angel, Mark Thompson. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And that dog of yours, he's got a soul as big as this country." Max, hearing his name, trotted over and rested his head on Martha's knee, allowing her to scratch behind his ears one last time. The departure was set for late afternoon. Mark packed his gear into the Ford truck. The old vehicle looked eager to get back on the highway. He checked the oil, secured the toolbox, and whistled for Max. Ashley stood by the gate, her arms crossed to keep from shaking. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved our lives." "You saved yourselves," Mark replied, opening the driver's side door. "I just evened the odds." He climbed in and started the engine. The rumble of the engine was a familiar comfort. "Take care of yourself, Ashley, and watch out for Mrs. Henderson. She drives like a maniac." Ashley laughed through her tears, waving as the blue truck pulled out onto the gravel road. Mark intended to slip out the back way to avoid any attention, but Silver Creek had other ideas. As he turned onto Main Street, he saw them. It started with Mr. Miller at the gas station, who stopped pumping fuel and stood at attention, removing his cap. Then further down the road, Earl the mechanic stood outside his shop, wiping grease from his hands and giving a thumbs up. But it wasn't just them. The sidewalks were lined with people. The news of what the drifter had done, how he'd stood up to the Sterlings and protected one of their own, had spread through the town like wildfire. Near the edge of town, a group of men stood in formation. They were the town's veterans. There was Mr. Abernathy, a 90-year-old World War II vet in a wheelchair, wearing his faded VFW cap and saluting with a trembling but proud hand. Next to him stood a Vietnam veteran with long gray hair and a leather vest, holding a small American flag. They didn't cheer. They didn't shout. They simply stood in silent witness, offering the highest respect one soldier can give to another, acknowledgement. Mark slowed the truck to a crawl. He didn't wave like a celebrity. He simply nodded, a slow, solemn dip of his chin, acknowledging the brotherhood of service. He saw the respect in their eyes, the recognition that he was one of them, a guardian who walked the lonely road so others could sleep safely. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and violet. The blue truck accelerated past the town limit sign, the tires humming on the asphalt. Max stuck his head out the window, the wind catching his fur, his eyes squinting against the golden light. In the rearview mirror, the town of Silver Creek shrank until it was just a speck in the vast American landscape. Mark adjusted his sunglasses, his hand resting casually on the steering wheel. The road ahead was long, winding through mountains and valleys, past cities and farms, full of new faces and unknown challenges. But for now, the traveler was content. He had done his job. He had left the world a little better than he found it. And as the truck disappeared into the setting sun, it left behind a legend that would be told on porches in Silver Creek for generations to come. The story of the soldier and his dog, who came from nowhere, brought justice, and rode off into the light. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the values that make this country great, please take a moment to share it with your friends and family. Your share might be the encouragement someone needs today. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story of hope, courage, and justice. Now let us pray. May the Almighty God watch over you and your loved ones. May He grant you the strength of a warrior to face your battles and the gentle heart of a shepherd to care for those around you. May He protect your home from harm and fill your life with His everlasting peace. If you believe that God is still in control and that good will always win over evil, please type Amen in the comments below. God bless you all, and until next time.